So it's the spring of 1980. I'm walking down a back street in my hometown, Newport, Rhode Island, and I need a haircut. I walk into a barber shop, and it's one of those old school places, right? So the big leather chairs, black combs and blue liquid. What was up with those combs, by the way? Old timers, rereading the sports page as the radio plays. So I settle into my chair, and it turns out the barber, another old timer, he's the inquisitive type. So he puts the things around me, and he says, so, what do? You work around here? I say, no, I'm in college. Yeah, all right. College, eh? Providence College, University of Rhode Island? No, actually, I'm in college in the Boston area. Oh, okay. So what's it, Boston College, BU? They say, no, actually, I go to Harvard. Yeah. Okay. He says, I got a couple of questions. He says, what's 25 times 25? Well, that's 625. Yeah. Okay. Here's another one. What's a half times a half? That's a quarter. This guy really does go to Harvard. The truth is, I was fibbing a little bit. I was a Harvard student, but in the spring of 1980, I didn't go to Harvard. I was taking time off. But when I look back on it, I'm certain that one of the reasons I was away from school and living at home is that school was not inspiring me. Simple as that. I wasn't doing anything that seemed to matter. Right? None of what I was doing in those classrooms, at least in my first 2 years, seemed to matter. Well, there's good news. I actually did go back after some time away, enjoyed it, and I did find some pockets of inspiration. In particular, I studied under a young professor named Marshall Hyatt, and we studied the life of Dr. King. I ended up doing an independent study with him. I'm old enough to have known, or to have remembered, if you will, the life of Dr. King, and I certainly was inspired by a man who thought about social change and how to lead a life of meaning. I went off to join the Peace Corps. I lived in Benin in West Africa, had a great experience there, came back to the States, ended up at a place called Middlebury College, where I studied Spanish for a summer. Kind of liked that place. I ended up coming out to the West Coast. I worked for something called the East Bay Conservation Corps in West Oakland, and found myself in my late 20s in Washington, D.C. And there I got a master's degree in international economics, and I specialized in social change and development. So now it's the fall of 1990, and I'm in a snappy dentist's office, and I'm waiting to get my teeth looked at. I've got another chatty type, but this time the dentist is a young guy. Turns out he's a New Englander. We start to bond. You know, how about those Red Sox? That's at least 5 minutes right there. And we're chit-chatting, this, that, or the other. Good guy, right? And I'm telling him about what I'm learning. I'm really excited, you know, having a good time. And every once in a while there's cotton in my mouth, you know, but it works. So by the time I came back 2 weeks later, I had to come back for some follow-up. I give him a big old hearty handshake and, you know, those damn Sox, they lost again. You know, we settle down. And off we go where we left off. And then something unusual happens. He looks down at me, a lot of cotton in my mouth, and he says, John, I want to know one thing. Are you a philosopher? Okay, so in a moment I figure out what's going on, right? We'd actually, you know, become kind of friends here, and he was interested in what I was talking about. He wanted to dig a little deeper, you know, what's my view on life? So, man, I was ready for that question. So he takes some cotton out, and like, off I go, and I'm like, oh, I can't believe you're asking me about that, right? So I've been reading a lot of Einstein lately, and it turns out Einstein was inspired by Spinoza. So here's the thing about Spinoza. Spinoza saw God as what was revealed to us in our day-to-day lives. So, you know, what you saw, what you witnessed, what you experienced, that's God. And I pause, and then there's Pascal. Pascal's amazing. So I'm really getting into this. So here's what the dentist is doing in the meantime, right? As I begin, he's going like this, Then when I sort of get into Spinoza, it's like, and then by the time I I turn the corner on Pascal, it's a look of horror. So the best I can do at this point is sort of trail off and see what's going on. And he goes, he says, John, that's really interesting, but what I wanted to know is, are you a flosser? Do you floss your teeth? It's a true story. But again, actually, I was fibbing a little bit because, in truth, I wasn't a philosopher, though I did have some aspirations at the time to philosophy. And what I was starting to get on fire about, as I look back now, was in some ways the idea that knowledge could matter. In the master's program that I mentioned at Johns Hopkins, I had a mentor, Grace Goodell, fabulous professor, and we studied very hard, we learned hard. She pushed us, unlike probably any professor I've had. I revisited the work of Dr. King. We read Paulo Freire, people who thought about social change and how to do it. The key to the success of that class was, though, that we began to get out into the field. So we spent some time interviewing heads of NGOs in Washington, D.C., met with working class families. I began to see, I know now, a view of education, a view of what could happen in the classroom that was leading out, in fact, that was not that hierarchical, rather stiff approach that I had seen too often at Harvard. And now I want to take you to, it's December 2003. I'm sitting in a classroom. I'm surrounded by some really smart people. We've all been brought together for a workshop to think about sustainability and social change. And I'm sitting in this chair, and I'm getting impatient, and I'm starting actually to get kind of upset. And the reason is this. There's a lot of this, you've all been to conferences, a lot of this kind of stuff. But there wasn't any action, there wasn't really any commitment to doing anything. And at the time, I was feeling an urgency about global warming. I was starting to study through my eyes as an economist and through the work I was doing in environmental studies, the specter of runaway climate change. Thanks to many colleagues, thanks to my colleague at Middlebury, Bill McKibben, I guess I had begun to pay attention. So as I'm listening to these great academics talk about another research study or some paper that somebody had done, I'm finally getting frustrated, and I just stand up at the end of the first day and I say, look guys, you know what? If any of this matters, we should connect the challenge of global warming to movement building. Maybe there's something there. I know. Let's organize a march on Washington to fight global warming. Well, that was actually kind of the reaction. And why would I have had the temerity, the audacity to say that a professor would be thinking that way? Well, in some ways, it goes back to the guy you're seeing on the screen, Howard Dean. If you were following politics back then, you know that December 2003 was the apogee of the Dean campaign. That's when it peaked. I had actually, at Middlebury that very month, given a talk about the Dean campaign. And my claim at the time was that the Dean campaign would change everything, that it would help us to connect in new ways and could actually affect social change. And the reason I believed that was that the Dean campaign had adopted something that many of us thought was creative and indeed something that inspired many of us. It was an approach that was open source, right? Look at this definition, the rapid creation of solutions, an open, collaborative environment. Doesn't that sound like the way things should be? Well, the Dean campaign back then thought that the answer was yes. The brilliant campaign manager of the Dean campaign, Joe Trippi, had decided, let's turn a political campaign on its head. Instead of a candidate and a campaign manager and everybody with marching orders through some organizational chart, let's essentially forget all that, Paying attention to the technological tools that were emerging about 10 years ago, Trippi said, let's essentially give the power to our volunteers. And that's what happened. So the Dean campaign, for example, allowed you through the internet to meet up with people that you didn't know and say, do a fundraiser. Wasn't authorized by anybody, right? You could talk through a new technology called blogs. This was very revolutionary. The Dean campaign was exciting because it wasn't about the person at the top. It was about us. It was about re-envisioning a world where we were connected, where we believed in social change, we believed in a future that was better. It sounds exaggerated at the time, but really, that's how it felt. So at that time, as 2003 became 2004, I was thinking about open source, that kind of creativity, that kind of decentralized approach. So thus a course was born called Building the New Climate Movement, which happened in the subsequent January of 2005. As that class began, as I began to imagine it, I was asking myself, what would an open source course look like, right? So how could you take the elements you see here, creation of solutions, an open collaborative environment, and convert them, as the Dean campaign had, to something in a new context, in my case, education. So I want to tell you the story of what happened. I walked into the classroom the very first day. I told them they'd be working very hard. And the students could see right away that something new was happening, that I was tossing away hierarchy. And they could see that I was embracing something maybe that they hadn't seen before, the idea that we were going to create some knowledge about building a climate movement together, that we were going to roll up our sleeves together. Something else happened in this class that was by no means novel. They were committed to the idea of learning in groups, right? That's the way you learn, isn't it, in small groups. And in the case of this class, what happened is that I had them break down into 5 groups, and then they started working with groups around the country who were dedicated to building what was then a nascent movement, a nascent climate movement. These included small groups, a local group called the Middlebury Global Warming Action Coalition, a wonderful group of earnest and strong and smart Vermonters who were trying to do something at the local scale. It included the Clean Air Cool Planet, which is a very successful regional group that was starting to affect change in New England. Another collaborative group was Energy Action, which was then an emerging network of organizations, clubs on campuses in North America and Canada dedicated to fighting the climate, or to building the climate movement, to fighting global warming. Energy Action has gone on to be very successful. Some students worked with Environmental Defense Fund, thinking about modeling and economics and how you could apply that to political campaigns. And there was even a group that worked with Ben & Jerry's. They got the best project, actually. A lot of ice cream there. So the students began to see, as did I, the power of working in groups, how that works. Then there was using networks. Basically, the students discovered through those collaborations that I mentioned that networks matter, that you can create networks, learn from networks. I began to talk in that class about the porousness of the classroom walls, that the learning happened through the walls. And that began to happen, they began to witness it. The 2 most important parts of this, what was emerging for me, approach of open source learning were as follows. Unlike what I witnessed at Harvard, the students were suddenly realizing that you could create knowledge for the present, that knowledge could matter and it could matter now. So after the second and third week of the class, when the students were doing that collaborative work with those 5 groups I mentioned, we had a conference. It was 3 days. About 120 people assembled to our campus up in Vermont, Middlebury. These were young leaders of, again, what was the new climate movement, as well as many who were established. We had John Pasicatondo, CEO of Greenpeace USA. We had Billy Parrish, the young leader of Energy Action that I mentioned. We had Mary Lou Finley, who as a young woman had marched alongside Dr. King in the 1960s. And we had my esteemed colleague Bill McKibben, who with his words and soon his action was inspiring so many of those young people. It was 3 days that we'll never forget. And the students, when they presented their work, their research, when they interacted with folks, began to understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were creating now And most importantly, they were creating for the common good. They were creating for the vision of a better world. They were creating for the vision of something much bigger than themselves. I want to bring you back to one moment in the class after the conference that you can see here. And here's the moment. It was about the third week, and we were studying the civil rights movement. I was up at the board. I'm a lefty, so I was like this. And I was talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which many of you know was founded in 1960 by a young college kid named John Lewis and many of his friends. And we were asking ourselves that day, how is it that some young leaders could go on and create something so important as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, a group that made a difference in the 1960s? How did that happen? So I'm up on the board, and I'm writing SNCC, SNCC, and I start to play around with those letters and put in climate in there somehow. And just as I'm getting a jolt right down my spine right now, I got one then. Because I turned to the students, I can see them right now, and I said, you know what? This could happen. I said, we could do that. You could do that. And there was sort of lightning. That's what happened. 4 of those students joined 3 other students at the time. And about 2.5 years later, with my colleague Bill McKibben, co-founded 350.org, which is now the world's largest and most successful organization dedicated to fighting the climate movement. Now, I don't want you to clap for me, really. What I want you to clap for is this: the idea that what we teachers can do in the classroom really can matter, and that on occasion, the right constellation of things will come together and social change is possible. But really the key insight, I think, is this: what I did with them over those 4 magical weeks was necessary, but was by no means sufficient. 350.org exists because of the sobering scientific analysis of Jim Hansen, who has told us that 350 parts per million is the target for carbon in the atmosphere, as opposed to the 390 we're at now. 350.org exists because of the leadership and brilliance and eloquence of Bill McKibben, who has dedicated his life to making this work, ever since writing The End of Nature in 1989, the first popular book about global warming. 350.org exists because of the pluck and vision and brilliance and dreaming of those students, and now the 40 staffers that comprise 350.org. So, open source learning, necessary, but by no means sufficient. Now, you would be right to say, maybe that was a one-off. Maybe, you know, that is never going to happen again. And you could be right. But in fact, now with this Center for Social Entrepreneurship that was mentioned, we're trying to do more of this. Thanks to the generosity of the Hassenfeld Family Foundation and other donors, we're trying to plant seeds for this idea all over the place. And I'm honored to be a part of it. Thank you.